My presentation, my experience comes in two conflicting worlds. There's the world of theory, mathematics, measure theory, machine learning, artificial intelligence, if you like. But in finance, it conflicts a little bit with the practical world, which is results. And so I hope you'll find the next 10 minutes to be educational, but also a little bit entertaining. So what has been done with artificial intelligence, deep learning, and financial markets? I'm going to talk about realized alpha, so a theoretical model that we built. I'll show you how we built it exactly, and then test the theoretical results with the practical results. Does it work in the real world? And then, since the theme of this conference is disruption, for the first time today I'm going to introduce a new financial derivative. And I believe it could be the largest insurance swap market in the world, but we'll get there. All right. So we had a surprisingly powerful starting point when we were looking at equity returns. And we actually started with fraud. Fraud as determined by the SEC. And because of our analysis of fraud, we had to change the entire taxonomy of the financial statements. And we had to look at things from a forensic point of view as opposed to a fundamental point of view. It turns out that when you look at fraud as defined by the SEC or punished by the SEC, if you have this model, it actually predicts credit default swaps pretty well too, just something to know. But from this forensic analysis came the actual deep learning, came the alpha, the theoretical alpha, and then what I will demonstrate, the realized alpha. It's called the forensic alpha model, and it's been published in the Ruman International Journal. Oh, sorry about that. All right, so here are the theoretical results of the forensic alpha model. Right? This is the theoretical results of artificial intelligence. The blue line is the top 5% rated companies over a 12-year period. The green line is the poorest rated, the worst companies. And you can see this vast difference in the compounded annual growth rate. This is starting at $1,000, so the worst companies lost about 80%, and the best companies tripled or quadrupled. But this is theory. And almost anyone can create a theoretically good-looking model for the stock market. In fact, that's kind of the problem. So in practical use, at the hedge fund governance investors, where I was a hedge fund manager, over a 2-year period, we used this strategy, long and short, and we outperformed our benchmark, which was the S&P 500, on a relative basis by 60%. And our standard deviation of returns, so a measure of risk, was 50% less than the Standard & Poor's 500. So for those of you that like Sharpe ratios, we more than doubled the Sharpe ratio of the S&P 500. And this is where we sort of proved it to ourselves. Does history in theory work in real time in practice? And it did. And perhaps we were lucky, but the results mirrored the theory. I'm going to skip this slide for now in interest of time. I'll come back to the subject. So, great, artificial intelligence, big phrase, everyone's using it, and it's definitely going to change the world for sure, I'm sure of it. Or maybe not. This is how we actually built it for alpha. Started with the metric, like accounts receivable over sales. Everybody loves accruals, right? There's not enough information in the financial statements if you're just looking at things like that. And so we did operations on the metrics. We did something to the line items to extract information that we could then put into a neural network. So look at some sort of industry comparisons, some sort of volatility, some sort of 1-year change. I'm just going to talk about the volatility just as an example to make this feel a little bit real world. So what you're going to see here, 2 companies, one on the left, one on the right. We've got their accounts receivable over sales on the y-axis, and on the x-axis is just time. And you'll see if you draw an ordinary least squares regression line, they look identical. These companies look identical. Let's move on. But that's not quite right. If we then plot the data, which comprised the linear regression, we'll see the company on the left is fairly tightly distributed, and the company on the right is kind of all over the place. It's this error term in the regression that we used as one of our metric operations. So we're actually measuring volatility as a remnant of a supervised learning algorithm. So we're taking a machine learning, and we're later going to put that machine learning into another machine learning algorithm. That does mean there's a lot of data, though. So if we label our metrics, we take each metric, and then you do 3 operations on each metric. And you do it for 40,000 companies. And then you do it for 15 years. And for each year, you have 4 quarters. You end up with hundreds of millions of pieces of data, which can be good, but can also be detrimental. But in order to get the practical result that we got, it actually working, we did require this much data, and the data itself had to be rich enough to put into a deep learning algorithm. So each of these pieces of data are already sort of, think of them as an atom with electrons spinning around them. They're already learning algorithms themselves. We did have enough data to cross-validate, get rid of bias, which we've often called overfit, but also enough to get rid of calculation and cognition traps. There are a lot of cognition traps when you're trying to predict stock returns. And in the end, we had to make some decisions about which metric operations actually went into our neural network, and we used another machine learning algorithm to trim it. We went into what's called an input layer. We then let them all interact together into hidden layers. Hidden layers are sometimes called deep learning. That's where you hear the phrase deep learning. And ultimately, there's a result. It's a stock price or a stock return. But we came across something very interesting. And it's even more exciting than stock returns, if there is such a thing. It turns out that the cornerstone of our research, fraud, acts like a self-affecting event. It comes in clusters, which means it's path-dependent. So this is actual fraud over the last 15 years. You can see in the green-colored bars, it's clustering. That means one fraud impacts the likelihood of another fraud, and then another fraud, and then it decays exponentially. So if we tried to plot fraud as a process which is path-independent, which we're all taught is the truth in finance, what you would like to see is these blue dots fitting on the red line, but it doesn't work. This is a homogeneous Poisson process, but it doesn't matter. It's a path-independent process. It doesn't work. This flies against all theory. And then we tried something else. We went to our great friends in Japan, wonderful mathematicians who deal with seismic activity, earthquakes. And it turns out that earthquakes cluster. When an earthquake comes, the likelihood of another one coming after it increases. For those of you who live in California like me, this is terrifying. But it's also true. And when we fit fraud to a Hawkes process, that is a path-dependent process, one that's self-exciting, one that causes itself to happen again, fraud fits almost perfectly. And you think now about insurance markets. The credit default swap market reached $26 trillion in notional, that's how much money was getting protected, within 6 years. So the appetite for portfolio insurance is voracious because as investors, we're willing to speculate, but there are some risks we're unwilling to take. The CDS market reached $60 trillion at the height of the Great Recession, or right before it, I should say. Today, it stands at sort of an equilibrium of $10 trillion. But that's just credit. Think about debt and equity. It turns out that the probability of a company engaging in fraud is nearly 1 in 7. 1 in 7 companies is committing a fraud every year. And the impact of that fraud is more than 1/5 of the enterprise value. Fraud is literally stealing funds from the market at an extraordinary rate. So we've modeled and created and demonstrated through other wonderful mathematicians explicitly that a bid and offer market could exist here with the facilitator of an investment bank. And we could immunize the world from these $3 trillion of losses every year in a swap market. And if you think of the $18 trillion in US mortgage-related and corporate US bonds, $40 trillion in the US stock market, $80 trillion in, let's say, larger world stock markets, we're looking at $3 trillion a year that we need to get rid of. We need to immunize. And that's what the fraud swap allows us to do. So what has been done with artificial intelligence, deep learning, and financial markets? We had a simple model for fraud, which we didn't really talk about that much. Had a little bit of machine learning, not a lot. We created a deep learning model for alpha. It's the forensic alpha model. Those were the stock returns I showed you in the practical results. And then if you add a little bit of measure theory, and you break some of the rules of finance, and you borrow from some of the great mathematicians in Japan, you can create a process that models a portfolio of fraud. And we've created a new financial derivative, which as of today, if you go to the United States Patent and Trademark Office, has been submitted. Thank you so much for the time.
Thank you, Ophir. That's a great way to get us up and running. And next, we're going to hear from Ruman Chowdury, Global Lead for Responsible AI at Accenture Applied Intelligence.
Thank you. So my name is Dr. Ruman Chowdury, and as Rory mentioned, I lead Responsible AI at Accenture. So to do something totally different, I have no slides. So my role is quite a unique and a very interesting one. And actually, jobs like mine have really never existed. So I live within a corporate entity, Accenture, 450,000 people all over the world. But I also am responsible for understanding implications of technology on humanity. Now, where I sit in the organization is also quite interesting. I do not sit within corporate social responsibility or outside of business functions. I actually am developing a practice, a business, around the responsible use of artificial intelligence and other technologies, which is, again, an interesting new territory that we're walking in. So I wanted to talk a bit about what I'm working on, but also what it means for everybody in this room and for society at large. So first, I want to talk a bit about artificial intelligence and so what it means. Let's frame the discussion a bit. So when we talk about AI, I used to teach data science before I joined Accenture. And the way I would start off explaining to my students, you hear these words like algorithm, model, and we sort of get what it means. But when we really think about it, what is a model? Why do we use the word model? And what I would do is bring in an actual model airplane and say, like, this is a model, right? It is a model airplane. We use the same word that we would use for a neural net that you train on finding a medical condition, right? So what is this model airplane? Well, you can learn a lot from looking at this airplane. If you've never seen a plane before and I handed this to you and I said, this is a thing that exists in the world, it's called an airplane. This is not an airplane, but it is a reasonable model representation of it. So you would learn a lot. You could learn about how airplanes are shaped, maybe certain functionalities about them, maybe certain details about them that are of use to you, right? But it's not actually a plane. It doesn't actually fly. It doesn't hold people in it. And I would remind my students that every single time you build a model, what it is a representation of the world. It is not actually the world. Why is that important? This is where my job comes in. Any gap that's left between the model and reality is essentially bias. When we use these words, bias, discrimination, et cetera, that difference, that error, is also known as bias. Now, my job, as I mentioned, I sort of straddle these multiple worlds. Now, when we use this word bias as a data scientist, it actually means something quite different than what it means when the media or lay people are talking about the term bias. So when a data scientist talks about the term bias, it is usually a quantifiable amount, and it is a function of some operational function or something that went into the model that you built. So there could be things like a measurement bias. I have a ruler. My ruler is 1/10 of a centimeter off, so every measurement I get is just a little bit off. Or there could be another measurement error is human error. I was just tired. I was ticking off boxes. I accidentally missed a box or two. You can have design bias. So when I created the product itself, there's some bias that went into the development of it that's leading to an output that's not entirely perfect. And there's actually an entire fields of study of the different kinds of bias that can exist. One that you may be familiar with is response or reporting bias, which I sometimes call the Yelp effect. So when you go online, any of these websites like Yelp, where you are rating things, people tend to rate only if they really love or really hate their experience. No one goes on Yelp and says, I had a completely average experience, I was a completely mediocre to sandwich I would have expected, and that's that, right? Nobody goes on Yelp and says everything was average. You go when you have an opinion. But what that leads to is a bimodal distribution, data here and data here, and you're actually missing, it's a systematic bias. You're missing a pocket of data right in the middle. And all these things are very important when you develop your model, your imperfect representation of the world, because there is something systemic to what's missing in the data. So what's comfortable and familiar about that world for data scientists is if it's measurable, I can fix it. So I can find that data of the people who had average experiences. I can fix that ruler or get a new ruler. Great. Now, when non-data scientists, when the media talks about, the public talks about the word bias, and especially ever since the narrative of ethics and AI became bigger in the United States, it sort of started in Europe, in the UK, has come over the United States fairly recently, our narrative is about a different kind of bias, and it's what I call the isms: sexism, racism, ageism, things like homophobia, right? So they're the isms. There's discrimination as the discrimination against people in society, and often these are the marginalized communities. Now, why does that matter? Why does that difference matter? Because the second is often a lot less measurable. And when I give this talk to data scientists, I make sure to make the following point twice, and this is where the difference is, this is where the difference matters. Now, for a data scientist, if I think of bias as something measurable and therefore I can fix it by adding more data, which is often the narrative you hear, right? Facial recognition is not recognizing dark-skinned women's faces, therefore let's add more images of dark-skinned women. Problem solved. The problem is data is simply reflective of existing cultural, institutional, and social biases. Data is not an objective truth. And maybe that sounds obvious when I say it, but when most practicing data scientists do their job, they often forget that. They often forget that just because the data says so doesn't mean it is a ground truth and what the reality should be. Now, we have an opportunity with artificial intelligence to really make some serious changes here. And here's where I introduce a concept that I call the retrofit human. Now, so there's this fundamental belief, I live in Silicon Valley, there's this belief in Silicon Valley that the human condition is flawed, and technology is what will save us, that technology is the perfection that will get rid of all the human inconsistencies, what I actually call the beautiful messiness of humanity, right? So what we do is we pitch this technology, and then actually the technology is more limited because we live in a world of narrow AI, not general AI, so we have to separate the two. We live in a world of quite limited applications of artificial intelligence. And as long as we do, the things we imagine in our heads that the movies gave us, it's actually not the artificial intelligence we're really going to achieve. And we have to understand that. Because what we do is we expect humanity to fit within the limitations of technology. So contrary to the Silicon Valley belief that human condition is limited, technology is what will save us, what we are finding is that the technology is limited and we're forcing human beings to fit within that paradigm. And I'll give you an example. When you heard about self-driving cars, the notion of self-driving cars, probably about 2-3 years ago at this point, maybe even longer, everybody, all of us, the collective imagination was about the same thing. We imagined ourselves living somewhere about an hour outside of work, getting into our cars and napping on our way to our jobs, or checking emails, or chatting with our friends. And the earliest concept cars that they built for self-driving cars would often have seats facing each other. Some of them even had like LED screens where you would watch things, because why would you need to look out the window? Your car is driving itself magically and beautifully, and you don't have to worry about rush hour traffic or deer running in front of your car or missing an exit or anything. And you could do things, as I mentioned, like nap, check emails, catch up on your phone calls. Now, we're a few years in from that dream. And instead, what are we seeing? Well, if we use the Uber self-driving car accident, the self-driving car hits a person, and when it goes to court to see who's liable, courts decide, well, Uber is not liable. Who might be liable? Oh, the person meant to drive the car. So, okay, given that the technology is quite limited, and there's a lot of articles, a lot of things you can read about how it's quite difficult for these cars to make left turns, how it doesn't know, there's what they call shadow braking, where it recognizes a shadow as a car and abruptly will stop you on a freeway. So we have these limitations. You know, not to blame Uber, but self-driving cars have led to at least one death that we know of. And, well, we've decided legally that the liability will fall on the individual driving the car. Okay, so what does that mean? There go our dreams of napping. And what we will have to do now is, in our self-driving cars, sit in the driver's seat with our hands at 10 and 2 and a foot on the brake. So we will have to drive our self-driving cars. And this is what I call the retrofit human. We have bought into this dream of a magical technology, and we are so invested in that dream. We are willing to subsume ourselves, our own autonomy, but also absorb the negative externalities and liabilities of the shortcomings of the technology. Meanwhile, billions of dollars continue to be poured into this industry. Now, why does that matter? How does that relate to bias and discrimination? Well, as we try to build, scale, and enterprise-level create artificial intelligence technologies, we lose out on the nuances of human beings, on the beautiful messiness of humanity, on the individual communities. And guess what? When I talked about bias as being discriminating against the most marginalized and vulnerable communities, that is exactly what happens. So some of the first uses of facial recognition technology have been, guess what? To put it into an apartment complex, a lower income apartment complex in Brooklyn. Why? Because they want to monitor the people going in and out. Now we're celebrating a bit of a victory today. We're celebrating a victory in that the use of facial recognition by government has actually been banned in the city of San Francisco. Now there are bills on multiple levels in the US try to ban this technology. And what's really heartening here is that people are starting to understand that actually the technology is quite limited, that actually retaining our personal autonomy, our individuality is what matters. And what's the most important is that we don't get shoved and retrofit ourselves to fit the limitations of the technology. Thank you.
Ruman, thank you very much. Lots of food for thought. And finally, one of the big thinkers, one of the big current thinkers of AI, Professor Nick Bostrom from the University of Oxford, Director of the Future of Humanity Institute. Thank you.
Yeah, artificial intelligence has been a big focus of ours at the Future of Humanity Institute for the last 10 years or so. You could almost say obsession, really. So I thought I'd say a few words about why it is that we have become so fixated on this, and why over the last 8 years or so it's also started to enter kind of the mainstream conversation. I think AI is different, fundamentally different from a lot of these other kind of buzzwords that are floating around. Ultimately, I think what we are talking about is the mechanization of thinking, which will be, I think, the biggest thing that has ever happened in human history. And like bigger even than the Industrial Revolution, and maybe comparable only to the rise of the human species in the first place. If you think about what it would really mean to be able to do all the things one day that the human brain does, more efficiently in machine, it's really the last invention that we would ever need to make, because then the machines could do the further inventing on digital timescale. So it's this prospect, even if it's not going to happen next year, but maybe it's going to happen in our lifetime. It's the immensity of this prospect that tends to drive our interest in this. It's one of the few technologies that at a really fundamental level could change the human condition. So I think to get a kind of feel for what this AI thing is, we need to recognize that our intuitions have been shaped by what AI used to be. In the 50s and 60s and 70s, artificial intelligence was about building expert systems. So you would have some engineer come in, and then a domain expert, maybe somebody running an electric power grid, or a doctor would try to articulate all the principles that they used in their work. And this would be coded into a big database. But the AI, the intelligence part, was really only the ability to make simple logical deductions from this data. And you only got out what you had put in. So these systems had some very narrow applications, but they were brittle. They didn't scale well, hard to maintain. Another thing that good old-fashioned AI was able to do was, say, in robotics, where you could pre-program a set of motions, and you could then execute those over and over again. But these traditional industrial robots, still today, lack environmental awareness. They don't see, they don't hear, they have no conception of their surroundings. But that's something you could also do with old-fashioned AI. And the focus about 8 years ago started to shift with the deep learning revolution, where instead of trying to build these customized systems, automate specific processes, the cutting edge moved to try to develop learning algorithms, general methods for building capability by getting in a lot of data or through trial and error. So it became possible to take a picture, for example, and to look at the picture and form some conception of what the picture was a picture of. So this is from, I think, about 6 or 7 years ago. And this was not at all possible with good old-fashioned AI. This is something you can't do. You can't write down an explicit rule that like defines whether a certain set of pixels is a picture of a cat or a dog. You might think, didn't like Google have image search and so on more than 8 years ago? Well, but it used to be done in a very different way. You'd have a web crawler that would go to a page and it would see a picture and it would see that the heading of the page was like something about cats, and maybe the caption contained the word cat. So Google would think maybe it's a picture of a cat, but it wouldn't actually look at the picture to make that determination. But with these kind of deep neural nets, you could do that. You could also generate pictures, let's say, from these by using something called generative adversarial networks. Really, you have two of these networks, one that tries to generate a picture and another that tries to tell you whether it's a real picture or a generated picture. So you train these up in tandem, and the better one gets, the stronger the training signal to the other. And you could, by 2014, start to actually have something that's a little bit like artificial imagination, the ability not just to say whether a picture is a picture of, but actually to paint, as it were, to imagine. So you have, say, a fairly blurry, simple face. By 2015, you can have color. Then progress is rapid. 2016, 2017, you have something that is virtually photographically accurate. And then this is from last year, where you see these are really hard to see, that they are just imaginary people. And you can then generate arbitrary numbers of these. These are all people who don't exist, but just kind of dreamed up by one of these generative adversarial models. So you could generate other product categories. So this, I think, like we so quickly start to take this for granted. So maybe this is still slightly impressive, but I'm sure a few years from now it will just be, yeah, whatever, you can generate pictures. But this was like beyond the wildest imaginings just 10 years ago. And it's amazing just how fast progress has been once we got the hang of this. You also, I mean, the ones you show in the press releases are the good ones. So you do sometimes get imperfections as well. You can kind of see, it's interesting the way that they are imperfect. Is that the local texture is kind of good, but sometimes the overall conceptual understanding is missing. And that is a limitation of a lot of these current deep learning systems. They're really good at the perceptual elements. You could say it's a slight overstatement, but you could say that we've solved perception now. What is still not quite there is the conceptual. You could do style transfer, the same kind of technology here. You have a real video on the left of a horse, and you give the network the word zebra, and it then tries to imagine what the video would have been like if instead of a video of a horse, it had been a video of a zebra. And again, it's pretty good. If you look at the tail, you can again see some of these artifacts of the zebra tail. You can see it has little stripes. And more recently, you can have, this is a real video on the left, and the Colbert is a kind of imagined by the network what Colbert would have looked like if he had said the same thing as the person John Oliver. And it's getting, I mean, it's a little bit blurry. You can kind of see it's not exactly right, but I mean, give it another couple of years, you'll probably be able to do pretty good so-called deep fakes, like where you would actually be able to impersonate, and with interesting usages, both positive in entertainment industry, but also the ability to like automate political propaganda, kind of create hit pieces where somebody is seen to do something or say something that they never did, and content stuff might go viral. So one of the sources of this great excitement has been this work in deep learning. Now, that can be combined with another class of algorithmic techniques in reinforcement learning. And you've all, I think, or most of you have seen this from a few years ago done by DeepMind here in London, where they developed an Atari playing AI. An interesting thing not being that you could build an AI that could play an Atari game. That you could have done with good old-fashioned AI, but you build an AI that could learn to play Atari games without actually being told at all how to do it. Just from the raw pixel feed and trial and error. It could learn to play a simple game like this, but exactly the same system out of the box could learn to play a whole host of other Atari games. More recently, the same kind of technology, just with some tweaks and scaled up, can solve more complex environments. So here you have a three-dimensional environment where it can learn to solve tasks. This is from, I think, last year, also work by DeepMind, where you have an AI that can learn just from Google Street View imagery to learn to navigate to landmark in London, also using the same kind of reinforcement learning technology. The same basic principles were used in the victory of AlphaGo against Lee Sedol. And this is very impressive. I think it did like turn up in the news here in the West, but I don't think those of you who were here kind of realized just how massive an event it was in Asia, in Korea, where it happened, in China, where the game of Go is this very culturally important game that's been played for 3,000 years with many professionals. It really was a Sputnik moment, I think. And even more recently, these kind of real-time strategy games, which are very complex, also succumbing to the same kind of techniques. There's been deep learning, reinforcement learning, the combination of those, which is really powerful. And then the third factor, which also deserves a shout out here, is compute, the role that compute has played. The deep learning revolution really started when researchers figured out that you could, instead of running neural networks on central processing units, as in your desktop, you could run them on GPUs, graphics processing unit, as in a video game console. And that gave you a speed up of about a factor of 100. That made them possible to build big enough neural networks so that they could do something interesting, and then research started building. And more recently, the transition to ASICs, specialized circuitry. So you can now have in Google Cloud these tensor processing units, a circuitry that's built specifically for this. And if you look at the amount of compute used to produce these kind of marquee AI systems that are maximally impressive at any given time, you can see here the line here. It's on a logarithmic scale, so it's like a really exponential growth, where the doubling every 3.5 months of the amount of compute used in producing these most impressive systems. So that's a factor of 10 per year. Like that can't go on forever, but I think there are a few more years in the tank here, and that's going to continue to be a driver of rapid progress in deep learning. So I'm going to put down the pause there.
Nick, thank you very much indeed. We've now got time for discussion. 3 great presentations here. I've got a few questions. I know I've got questions coming in from the audience. Can I just start with you, Nick? As I said at the beginning, the last 5 years in particular has seen huge excitement, one could almost say hype about AI, spreading beyond what you might call the AI community. As you've looked at that and looked at the claims made, have you thought those claims were largely justified, or are people getting ahead of themselves in how far the technology has come, particularly in delivering real-world changes, real-world applications?
Well, there are a lot of claims made, so some are maybe over-optimistic and some over-pessimistic. I think in terms of people worrying, say, about impact on labor markets, I think that just hasn't been any massive impacts on labor markets so far.
There's that great Oxford study 5 years ago which said 40% of jobs.
Yeah, it said, but it's so far, I don't remember. I think it was like 10, 20 years timeframe that they had on that, and I guess it's been a few years, but I haven't seen. So I think that there's a tendency maybe to overhype the near term and simultaneously, I think, underhype the long-term potential of this. There is also a kind of, there's the real interesting work that is driving the state-of-the-art forward. Then there is a number of other actors that feel they need to be part of the buzz.
Yeah.
So then it's more like a labels smackdown, or some of these stunt robots, like Sophia, the robot, who got citizenship granted in Saudi Arabia, and it has like a human face, and so that's all just PR. With
Generally, domestic robots don't seem to be going anywhere to me. They seem
yeah, the cuter the robot looks, the more likely it is to just be hype.
Yeah. Ruman, some very provocative thoughts there. I mean, you mentioned today's ruling in San Francisco about facial recognition. Aren't we going to see a huge divergence between the US, I mean, the two superpowers in AI, the US and China, very different attitudes, frankly, to ethics. And isn't it going to be difficult for, even if big players in the US might want to take an ethical approach, they may look to China and look at the advances being made in facial recognition there and think, can we afford to be that ethical?
Well, I take a step back and let's sort of reframe that narrative. So interestingly, my group actually did a study of CEOs, and we asked actually what I call gray area kinds of questions, so ethical tension questions around technology. And just sort of a sneak preview, we're actually officially launching the study in a few weeks, but sneak preview, the US and China C-suite, not very different actually on how they would approach these different ethical questions. So I'm going to start by framing it that way. And the second is, I question the notion that the US is so much more ethical than China. You know, what would we say? So we're very focused in the US and talking about the Uyghur population and, you know, how artificial intelligence, facial recognition, et cetera, drones have been used to sort of marginalize, you know, and basically attempt to eradicate the culture of this group. Now, one may ask, would the US do something similar? Well, we're quite well known for things like predictive policing, right? For the use of image recognition and facial recognition that we know actually come from, that are built on biased data sets to then start policing low-income communities. So I question the notion that we are so fundamentally more ethical. And the third thing I worry about is that by building this boogeyman of China, we don't ask ourselves very fundamentally, what are we intended to do with this technology, and is it solving the problem that we say it is solving? Because we get so enamored of, oh my gosh, that's a face, and it's recognizing who it is, and it's calibrating across 30,000 data sets, and oh my goodness. But let's take a step back and think about the use of facial recognition, right? So we are told the story of, you know, national security, right? We can catch terrorists, we can find kidnapped children, et cetera. And yet, even on my Twitter feed, which tends to be full of AI ethics people and kind of a lot of doom and gloom sometimes, I do see all the studies that say, well, actually, we're living in some of the safest times ever. So the first question is, do we live in such a sufficiently dangerous world that we need this sort of mass level surveillance at the expense of what we will be giving up, which is our personal privacy and our ability to be anonymous in public? And the second half is, does this technology accomplish that goal? Does mass surveillance accomplish the goal of a flourishing and happy society? Anybody who has studied the notions of law and what the rule of law is might actually argue otherwise, that the rule of law is not achieved when everybody is constantly scared that every minor infraction will be caught, categorized, and fined. Actually, what that does often is erode social capital, our likelihood to just care for each other as human beings because we are human and we are in this together.
Can I put it to you that the difference between the US and China that's emerging is that US firms seem to be full of a workforce which is actively rebelling when they see their company going down the wrong path, which might not be quite so evident in China.
Maybe, I mean, so I do agree with that. We do have employees mobilizing, speaking out, and a lot of these facial recognition bans are coming from community empowerment, which I view as actually a good thing. Often who's left out of this narrative are the average people. And there was an article in Vox yesterday, and I actually had the same thing happen on a public radio show I was on that was about privacy and security. And pretty much the narrative in the public is, we get it, our information is taken, et cetera, but it's the cost of being a digital citizen. That is what I pay to be engaged in this new digital future. And that's an unfair it's an unfair narrative, because we have been systematically leaving people out of the conversation. And I think what we are seeing is this pushback, and I'm actually excited to see what that middle ground is.
Ophir, you talked about a practical application in finance of AI. Presumably, if this is such a step change, you will be fabulously wealthy very quickly if you're ahead of the game in this. Is that what's happening with your business? Is this such a game changer that anybody who does not use the techniques that you've described will basically be out of business quite soon?
Certainly people who are not using it will not be out of business unless they're not good at what they do outside of AI. A great fundamental analyst who doesn't use artificial intelligence at all is not going to go out of business unless they're not a great fundamental analyst. In terms of the models I've built, just so everyone knows, I'm not pitching my models, they've been sold to MSCI. So are they going to be fabulously wealthy? I don't know. Also, the world of finance, particularly markets, there's this great misunderstanding that if you have a model and it can return 18% a year with half the risk of the S&P 500, you are therefore going to be a trillionaire. No, the money you have will grow by 18% a year with half the risk of the S&P 500. In order to be a billionaire or a trillionaire, it will take 25 years. So raising capital and applying models to large sums of capital isn't quite as easy as people foresee. Having said that, in the broader scope of things, I do think that firms like Renaissance Technology that are using AI in-house models, so you can't even invest in some of their funds because it's kept in-house, they will start to squeeze some of the alpha out. And so if you're not broadly looking at learning from patterns, we don't have to call it artificial intelligence, let's say learning from patterns in a way that a human can't do it, but a machine can do it for you in some way, then eventually you will be left behind in some corners. But there will always be room for an analyst who can look at a relatively new company, speak with the CEO, and have an idea or perception of where the company is going to go, that AI will be behind. It would take years for the AI to catch up to that.
I've got a whole bunch of questions from the audience about your fraud predictor. What's the next level in using machine learning for fraud analysis? What could be, how did you determine that 22% of losses are caused by fraud? How are you defining fraud? Yeah. I suppose there...
Lots of good questions. Yeah. So the initial thing I presented, fraud, was defined by the SEC. It's called an AAER, Accounting Action Enforcement Release. A lot of letters. So literally, a regulatory body is saying fraud. The number for about 1 in 7 companies committing fraud and it costing 22% of enterprise value came from a fascinating paper, which I did not author, which came from the demise of Arthur Andersen. So in the United States, we had essentially a fraud epidemic. Enron and WorldCom, we had so many frauds at the end of the internet bubble. And Arthur Andersen, there used to be 5 large accounting firms in the US, the big 5, and they're now the big 4. Arthur Andersen went down. All of the companies that were audited by Arthur Andersen had to go to another accounting firm. So new accounting firms looked at these companies with new eyes, fresh eyes. And from that period, the paper determined that 1 out of every 7 companies was committing a fraud, and the auditors were uncovering it as they became their clients because they didn't want to face that litigation risk. One of the most interesting studies I've ever read, and it's very practical in the sense that it's looking at actual companies that were actually audited and actual misrepresentations and actual cost of those frauds.
Ruman, and I'm going to come to Nick as well on this. We've got questions about how can AI be regulated? There's a lot of talk around the world suddenly about regulation. It is all talk at the moment, isn't it? There's very little clarity on what regulation would look like or what it would be trying to achieve?
Yeah, it's a tough thing to do, well, for multiple reasons. So one, I would say GDPR kicked everything off because its notions of privacy, transparency, explainability, things like the right to not be found, which people in the US, for example, don't enjoy. Even if you have no social media accounts, et cetera, you can still be found, right? So the difficulty in legislation, there's sort of multiple parts to it. So I've had the privilege of advising different governments, seeing how this works all over the world. So when I say all over the world, I mean Brussels, UK, Singapore, US, and really I see like very common narratives. Number one, legislators and lawmakers are trying to understand a technology that is something that they're very, very unfamiliar with while receiving all this pressure to try to regulate. Number two is, what is it that you do regulate? Do you regulate the technology itself? The answer is no. You wouldn't regulate a hammer. You would say, don't break windows with the hammer, right? So you have to regulate an outcome. Well, how do you do that when it's a multiple purpose tool that can be used in any iteration of scenarios? That's quite difficult. So number three, where people are falling, which is kind of where I thought this would go, is how do we use existing protections to leverage on the use of artificial intelligence? So a good example in the US has been Facebook was fined by Housing and Urban Development. Why? Because their targeting algorithms were being used by landlords, and it was unfairly discriminating against African Americans, et cetera, right? So, and that is illegal under Housing and Urban Development law. Nothing to do with artificial intelligence. It had to do with you cannot discriminate on housing, things like jobs, et cetera, based on ethnicity, based on race. Well, it was a violation of an existing law, nothing to do with AI. So what we're seeing in the US with the Detour Act and the Algorithmic Accountability Bill, two bills that are out right now, is we're trying to understand how already protected classes, children is a good example. So how do we prevent the children from being manipulated by media? That's an angle people are taking. Why? Because we have these protections already. So what's interesting is the US, for example, doesn't have a specific body about technology, but you have the Federal Trade Commission, Housing and Urban Development, other groups seeing how what they have fits into the technology. So it's difficult because, again, they're sort of much like the rest of us in AI, they're learning to building the plane while flying it. But we are seeing some very quick advances, and I imagine it will snowball and go even faster.
Nick, I've got a question from the floor for you, which I'm going to convert into a question about ethics as well. Please tell us about AI reaching human intelligence and then going beyond to superintelligence, as you've talked about. You have talked about the implications of that. Do you, as a scientist in this field, sit and get very excited about that, or do you begin to ask yourself very profound questions about what you're doing and whether it's dangerous?
Both. I could say I'm a frightened optimist. I don't personally try to develop AI. We have a research group that is working on AI safety in my institute that is trying to think ahead to what kind of methods for controlling what an AI does we would need if at some point in the future we figure out how to make AIs arbitrarily smart, so scalable control methods that will continue to work no matter how intelligent the system becomes. So we have a group working on that, another group working on the governance of AI, again also thinking ahead to the kinds of capabilities that will be unleashed as the field progresses. So our focus is not so much in trying to accelerate progress towards greater levels of machine intelligence, but trying to prepare the world as best as possible so that we were ready to manage this transition to the machine intelligence era. But yeah, surely there would be enormous potential for valuable developments unlocked if we get that right. That's true.
And what is your current thinking about the rate of progress? We've seen great progress in very discrete areas, machines achieving particular tasks, but a lot of people in the field are saying general intelligence, machines that can multitask, as it were, is a very long way away. What's your take?
Well, I think progress has been faster than expected in the last several years. But the part of it that kind of impresses me is that the progress we've seen, it's towards developing these general purpose solution methods. And okay, maybe they are not yet strong enough to do all that we can do, but they're getting stronger each year. But the impressive thing is that once they get strong enough, it does look like they would do everything, because it's not like we are building these individual systems and you need to start from scratch to build another system. So it's a potentially extremely scalable approach to doing machine intelligence.
I've got a question here. What's the benefit of giving up your privacy? Millennials are happy to barter their data for services. This was overheard at the conference probably yesterday, I think. Let's ask all of you. I mean, a lot of these developments depend on a bargain between companies and consumers over data. Ophir, are we becoming more skeptical as individuals about that, or happy to, frankly, get free stuff in return for our data?
Both, right? You're asking a question about how individuals feel, and I think that question will go to the individual. Most of us have become a bit used to giving away some of our data just to function, just to go onto a website, just to even get a cup of coffee. Some people will feel less comfortable than others. There's something very different here in the UK and in the European Union, which is that the GDPR, right? So as an American, I come here and I go on the website and I see that every website gives me a warning. It's GDPR. We don't have that in the United States. So perhaps people in Europe are more aware of what they're giving away and when they're giving it away, and it's sort of an alarm. And so perhaps you will find individuals here who are less likely to give away everything. In the United States, you know, we're kind of blind to it. We go to a website and Google or Facebook is collecting information from us, from a Facebook pixel or from a cookie, and in that sense you're going to find the populace behaving in different ways based upon their cognition of what's actually going on. Remember, a lot of people don't know what's going on. Here, I can tell you, I've never been more aware of my data privacy since I came and I landed in London. Every single website I've gone to that I normally go to, all of a sudden I'm getting the GDPR, right? I don't have that in the US. There's no cognition. Very little, let's say. There's less cognition.
And a lot of people locally actually find that quite annoying. That's the interesting
Well,
part.
I would say even here it probably turns into just a okay.
Yeah.
Then does that make a difference? I don't know.
Oh, absolutely. The designers would call it friction, right? So I 100% agree with what you're saying. And I want to actually parse it out and say cognition versus choice. We don't have a choice in the United States. So as I mentioned, the narrative has become, well, if I want to function as a member of society, let's remove maybe social media from this. Actually, no, let's not. You know, media plays an amazing part in all of our lives. When someone says, oh, millennials are willing to barter their information, true but not true. Let's define who millennials are. I'm 39 and I'm a millennial, right? So millennials are not children. Millennials are not in their 20s wearing hoodies. That's actually Gen Z. Gen Z is actually much more particular about their online presence. They're much savvier. So I think it is a bit of a blunt instrument to say, quote, millennials or younger people barter their data. They are smarter about their data. They are aware that it is used, and they make sure that the persona they give is very carefully curated, and the information they share, they're getting something back. So they have more of a savvy interpretation of it. So to Ophir's point, and you're 100% correct, we are not given options in the United States. We cannot opt out. What do we opt out of? The very social fabric that makes up our lives. You know, and I will give you an example from my own life. The AI ethics community is built largely on Twitter. I know so many people, I meet people every single week I have never met in real life who I would consider my friends because I know them from Twitter. It is how we build our reputations, it's how we talk to each other, it's how we share information. How can we say that that is an option? It is not an option. But what we have done in the US is we haven't given people the privacy and protection, but we're saying you have to do this in order to be a functioning member of society. And our society exists both analog and digital. Our digital selves are of as much value as our analog selves, and we haven't respected that when we think about things like privacy and autonomy. So to your point, it's not just about cognition, it's about choices. We're not given choices at all.
Let's, as we come towards wrapping up, think of the positives here. I want each of you to think about what their hopes are for what AI can actually deliver to humanity over the next 5 or 10 years, from the basics in the finance industry to big issues like climate change. Nick, what would you hope we would be able to do in 5, 10 years' time with these tools that we can't do now?
5, 10 years time. Well, I mean, to some extent, just have a lot of things be a little bit more efficient. I mean, it's a general purpose technology that's gonna be applied across the economy. So you have some big logistics center somewhere that can maybe predict demand slightly more accurately, so they can lower stocks, and then it gets a little bit cheaper to buy stuff. So I think if you have like 1,000 applications of that type, each not very, stop the news headline producing, but they help contribute to economic growth. And I think that kind of mundane impact would be like what I would hope for the next 5, 10 years.
Ruman, what about you? I mean, you spend a lot of time thinking about the pitfalls, but there must be some promise there too.
I mean, what I'd say is all of us who work in the AI ethics community, we're actually fundamentally optimists. Because we actually believe that we can achieve much more with this technology than what we are achieving today. We can question very basic paradigms of economics, of global structures and regimes. And what I actually want, is for us to more fundamentally question a lot of the things that we assume to be given about society. And I like the statement you made earlier, Nick, about we're sort of short-term, overly cautious, and long-term, not cautious enough. And I think I would actually take that statement and say we are short-term, overly limiting ourselves into the potential, and long-term scaring ourselves too much. So we need to really think about how we can use this technology to question the social, economic, et cetera, structures that we've taken to be as a given. Because if we're going to call this a revolution, let's make it a revolution.
And Ophir, finally, make these people optimistic. Tell them they're going to make a lot of money.
What Ruman said is absolutely right. We have to be optimists if we're in this field. There's no other reason to be in it. And I can just get very specific rather than sort of broad. I would say where I'm most optimistic, I'll change my mind in 3 years, but as of right now, it's just healing the pain. So medicine is not done properly in the world, first world or otherwise. And what is going to come from artificial intelligence is going to be a way to heal people who are sick, to identify people before they get sick, to take away the pain. And so in terms of just a certain area of optimism, I'm absolutely over the top optimistic about how all of us will be doing within 5 to 10 years because of artificial intelligence and its applications to medicine, as long as governments don't get in the way.
Well, that's an inspiring thought on which to end. Nick, Ruman, Ophir, thank you very much indeed.